If the hero of Ferelden marries Anora and they don't have any children, but the hero of Ferelden also completes the dark ritual with Morrigan, does that make their son the rightful heir to the throne in Ferelden? Hello and welcome to the Exalted March, where I think out loud about Dragon Age, Mass Effect, and BioWare games in general. I started to think about this theory on my most recent playthrough of the Dragon Age games, and I'm sure I can't be alone. I can't be the only person who has thought of this before. But the basic idea, if for some reason you're listening to this and you haven't played the Dragon Age games, or if it's just been a while and you need a little bit of a refresher, the basic premise is that if you are a human male noble in Dragon Age Origins, so of course you've got all of the backgrounds to pick from, if you're a human male noble, then during the lead up to Dragon Age Origins climax, during the Landsmeet, when all of the nobility of Ferelden are trying to figure out who is eventually going to sit on the throne and rule Ferelden, there are some questions about Anora and her viability as a leader ruling by herself. And so, being of noble birth, you can put forth yourself as potentially marrying Anora and the both of you ruling together. She retains the title of queen, and you are given the title of king consort, but that's kind of irrelevant. I mean, you are married to Anora, so if you were to have kids, your kids would be the heirs to the throne. The key part of this theory is that it is insinuated somewhere, or, I mean, it's a bit more of an insinuation, honestly. I think either Loghain or maybe Duncan or someone, I can't quite remember who, during the early part of Dragon Age Origins, I think before King Cailan, or maybe shortly after King Cailan dies, suggests or brings up the fact that Anora maybe can't have children. I think it's stated she's either past her 30th year or nearing her 30th year, and her and Cailan have not been able to have kids, and the insinuation there is that they had been trying and they were unsuccessful. So that brings up an interesting point, in that if you are a human, male, noble background hero of Ferelden and you do marry Anora and you're not able to have kids, well then who is heir to the throne in Ferelden? Normally a royal bastard, which is what your son with Morrigan, Kieran, as we later learn in Inquisition, his name is Kieran, he wouldn't be eligible to inherit the throne, and certainly in this sort of wild theory that will surely never make it into canon or probably never even be touched upon in any of the future games, the Ferelden nobility would surely reject him as being a bastard. He is the son of the hero of Ferelden, who may be of noble birth, but he's also Morrigan's son, and if that were to ever come to light, they would reject him even more. Another angle in this theory is, of course, if Alistair sits on the throne and you have Alistair complete the dark ritual with Morrigan, then that complicates it in a sense even more, because at that point, because it's Alistair's son, that also means that Kieran is the legitimate grandson of Marek. And that means that he has royal blood from the Theron bloodline, and even more so, bastard or not, has some claim to the throne of Ferelden. Which I just find to be very interesting, because Kieran, of course, again, if you need a refresher on the Dark Ritual, essentially what Morrigan does is says, instead of upon killing the Archdemon, let me back up here. Essentially what happens when a Grey Warden kills the Archdemon is that the soul of the old god inhabits the Grey Warden and dies within the Grey Warden, thereby also killing the Warden that strikes the final blow. The Dark Ritual prevents that by redirecting, if you will, the soul of the old god into the soon-to-be child, who ends up being Kieran. So that's interesting, right? That's this sort of pseudo-demon kid who has the soul of an old god trapped in him, and is also, in my opinion, a Grey Warden, because that's never stated directly, but Grey Wardens are sterile after they complete the calling. They develop a tolerance or an immunity of sorts to the darkspawn taint in their blood, but it also makes them unable to have children, which is another thing that's brought up a little more significantly or clearly within the books. So Grey Wardens don't have kids, and the fact that you're able to kind of sidestep that also in completing the Dark Ritual with Morrigan means, in my opinion, that kid, Kieran, probably inherited the Darkspawn immunity, which kind of means he's like a Grey Warden kid. He's like a soul of an old god Grey Warden kid who is also potentially the next king of Ferelden. If somebody plays his cards right. So I think it's interesting if he is the son of the Warden. I think in some sense it's even more interesting if he's the son of Alistair. I know I talked about in a previous... I'm very reluctant to call them episodes, but whatever, for lack of a better term. In a previous episode, I talk about not making Alistair king and he's better off as a Grey Warden. But if you throw this theory on top of it, it's kind of even more interesting to think of Marik's grandson having the soul of an old god trapped inside of him and being kind of a Grey Warden kid and also a bastard and also kind of heir to the throne in Ferelden. Besides the obvious, there are a couple of kinks in this theory. I mean, number one, the most important thing is that the nobility of Ferelden would reject this. They would reject Kieran outright, and they would try and find somebody else to sit the throne much later on down the line. But another wrinkle is that it really does kind of hinge on Anora. Like, I kind of thought about it from one standpoint of, what if Alistair rules by himself? There's one option in Dragon Age Origins. I don't know if it's dependent on having a hardened Alistair at that point. I think it might be, but there is a way for Alistair to take the throne without marrying Anora. The reason why I don't think that works as much is because if he takes the throne and quote-unquote rules by himself, even though in Inquisition they still don't show him having married anyone else, surely by the time he at some point, the nobility of Ferelden is going to say, hey, we need to make sure this guy gets married to someone and produces one or two or multiple potential heirs to the throne to make sure that the bloodline is secure. So I don't know that Kieran would really be able to slide in there. There would be legitimate heirs who would be ahead of him for the throne. But again, when you throw in Anora, potentially maybe not being able to have children, that's when Kieran, although a royal bastard, would have a somewhat better chance, whether Anora is married to Alistair or to the Warden. I kind of personally like Kieran being the Warden or hero of Ferelden and Morrigan's son. I just think, especially if you romance Morrigan, it's kind of even cooler that your character from the first game, his son, is potentially the king of Ferelden down the line in some kind of alternate universe timeline, or if things go a very specific way. But it's also kind of cool if it's Alistair's son. This is all, of course, super far-fetched, and I don't think it's something that would ever approach being in any of the games, or probably not even in any of the books. It depends too heavily upon player choice, and BioWare has definitely said that they're not really sure how to include the Warden in future games at all because of so much player choice that takes place in Dragon Age Origins. They would have to canonize that in some way and take away, they would even just saying that the Warden was definitely a human noble male takes away all of the other origin choices. I mean, even human noble female is kind of taken out of the picture if you do this. Now, if you do it with Alistair, maybe it gives, in theory, more of a chance of showing up in some of the future Dragon Age stories, because then you don't actually have to make it dependent upon the Warden. It becomes dependent upon Alistair and Anora ruling together and Alistair having completed the Dark Ritual. Even that is tricky because it kind of takes away, it kind of sets definitively whether or not the Warden lived or died, and so it canonizes some of the events of Dragon Age Origins. That's why I don't think nothing will ever come of this, but in my headcanon, especially in my most recent playthrough, that's definitely the way that I played it. Human male noble, romance Morrigan, partake in the Dark Ritual, and marry Anora at the Land's Meet, and then in my head, when I run into Kieran later on in Inquisition, in my head I'm going to be going, that kid, he's the king of Ferelden. He's the next king of Ferelden. Nothing is likely to come of it, but I think it's a cool theory, and hopefully if you like to create headcanon yourself, maybe this is something you do on your next playthrough, and you'll get to enjoy that payoff of seeing Kieran in Dragon Age Inquisition. This has been The Exalted March. Thanks for listening. Masaranas.